Hi, and welcome to a small, medium, at large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate interviews beyond normal boundaries. I want to thank all you listeners for subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting, and just being there listening to the shows on all the different sites from YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all other all other sites for you to watch and listen. So today we have a special guest I want to tell you about named Jacob Glazier. Jacob Glazier holds an assistant professor of psychology appointment in the Department of Anthropology, Psychology, and Sociology at the University of West Georgia. He is the co-editor of the tri-yearly publication Mindfield, the Bulletin of the Parapsychological Association. He is interested in exploring the problematics of exceptional experience, psi as a critique of physicalist science, and the deconstruction of skeptical explanations of the paranormal. This approach he referred to as critical parapsychology. With specific regard to psi studies, his main area of research interest include ecology and the paranormal, animism, paraanthropology, the philosophy of parapsychology, psychoanalysts, and parapsychology and trickster theory. He has written Arts of Subjectivity and his newly released book, Paranormal Ruptures, Critical Approaches to Exceptional Experiences. Let's welcome Jacob here today. Hi, Jacob. Welcome.
Hi, Gail. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really excited to have the discussion with you today about all things paranormal.
That's really wonderful. I always start off all my guests with their childhood because I've heard the most interesting stories, and some of the time it does affect the work that and path that people are on. Sometimes it has nothing to do with it. So I'm wondering, in your family and in your growing up, were there things that happened that put you on this path of parapsychology and anthropology? Or was there nothing to do with your life then, and it came later in life as an adult? I'm just wondering how you got driven to this area.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I have so many stories about sort of, I guess, happenstance, how things just kind of fell into my lap. Parapsychology in one way is just sort of that happenstance. It just kind of came to me. Um, but I don't know. I think I'm not sure if this is paranormal, but I remember vividly when I was young, in grade school or younger, I remember having imaginary friends,
Mhm.
and sort of having a relationship with them. A little bit later on, I was, in maybe third grade, fourth grade, I was really interested in astronomy and space, and I wanted to be an astronomer, if you can believe it. There's too much math involved, so I had to change course. But yeah, and then I can remember vividly in my head, I had books, not fiction, but nonfiction sort of picture books about UFOs.
Wow.
Yeah. And, this is, I'm probably, a freshman, sophomore in high school. I mean, I was a little bit nerdy, right? I was really academic. So, it just was sort of, it just kind of kept coming back into my life. There was nothing, really explicit that happened. I mean, I can think of some, weird sort of sleep paralysis moments like in college that I would have, they kind of, threw me for a loop. But yeah, and so, I graduated my undergrad degree in philosophy and psychology, went on to get trained as a therapist, as a counselor, which I'm, so glad that I did that. And then came down when I should back up a second, when I was interviewing for admission into the PhD program at West Georgia, so University of West Georgia. I didn't know this at the time, but there's a tradition at that university to have a faculty member that is sort of designated as a parapsychologist. So, there's been several through the years. I think Raymond Moody was one of them. He, of course, famously wrote about NDEs, near-death experiences. Um, Dr. Bill Roll is another one. He, you know, published a lot on poltergeist activity. And so I'm getting ahead of myself. So I remember going to interview there down in Carrollton, Georgia. So I'm from Illinois, so I had to make the trip down and getting a handout of the different faculty, their research interests, and I don't know, for some reason this just sticks with me. I remember circling Dr. Christine Simmons Moore's biography. I just circled it. I'm like, oh, I'm like, this is really interesting. I don't have a lot of academic training in parapsychology, but I'm just really interested in this. And then so lo and behold, right, I get accepted to the program, and then I get assigned to Dr. Simmons Moore. She's my advisor, my mentor. And so I work underneath her as a graduate assistant. And so that was just an amazing experience, and I was able to kind of get immersed in the research and the literature on the paranormal. And then cut to maybe 5, 6, 7 years later, I get hired I get hired at the University of West Georgia as a full-time faculty member. And so it's just this, I don't know, it's like this cyclical relationship. Like I find myself kind of like getting away from it a little bit, but then something happens and I, circle back to it. So yeah, so that's where I'm at right now. Part of my research program is, I would say, explicitly on the paranormal, so parapsychology. And then, the other half is, and we can, talk about this a little bit later on, but what's called critical theory. So just, briefly trying to understand different power dynamics in like institutions and society and narratives, stories, and just how language and narrative kind of shapes our view of the world. So yeah, so I've got both of those going on, and funny enough, the book Paranormal Ruptures is kind of like a amalgamation, like a class, putting together of both those things, both parapsychology and critical theory.
So you weren't actually planning to fully go into it this way, but you knew you wanted to be a therapist. And then you ended up meeting all these amazing people who you just spoke about, who I've met them all, and they're all incredible. I did meet Moody, but I've met Bill Roll, and I've seen Simmons a bunch of different times. Met her before she was ever married and had children. And so you got to be really around some incredible people doing very, very good work. So that's that would be a wonderful opening to go down that path.
Yeah, well, it was, and it's interesting you say it like that, Gail, because I kind of just jumped on that. I was sort of kind of caught off guard that I found myself, at the University of West Georgia, and they, surprisingly had this tradition of parapsychology, so I kind of just jumped on it and I just followed it, and I don't know. It's strange. Sometimes I don't have a good vision sort of where I'm going. It's more of like an intuition. I just trust myself. This is what I'm interested in. I just follow that, and it's paid off so far. So that's always great.
I think that following your intuition or your gut, Dean Radin used to tell me that the gut is the other brain, that we have two brains in the body. And I find when I follow that, things go along smoothly for me. When I don't follow the gut and I say, oh no, that's when I end up having obstacles. So following your gut is a good piece of information here for us to share with our audience.
Yeah.
I before I go into questions about your book and about the critical approaches to exceptional experiences, I was wondering what personal paranormal experiences have you had? And also, part two of the question would be any anthropological experiences with other cultures. I was wondering what your direct experiences are, that not something you read about, but that you yourself experienced. Of course, there could be many, you don't have to share all of them, but if you could share just a couple of the top ones you'd like to talk about.
Yeah. I've got a sort of a list going on in my head. So I don't, I think what comes to mind, uh, and this isn't kind of very sensational, but it's still, kind of profound for me, is that oftentimes, not oftentimes, sometimes I should say, I'll dream something.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I find myself in that situation or a similar situation, the next day, in the next couple days. And so, of course, normal science, might call that deja vu, or might call that, that we're kind of tricking ourselves or deluding ourselves in some way. But that happens. That happens for sure. For me. I think, yeah, I'm just sort of hung up on dreams. I have, very sort of strange, I think they're non-typical dreams, that seem to happen, or I guess even visions sometimes. Um, and so, I haven't had to, like being abducted by aliens or anything like that, like something crazy. But I think, and this is part of the reason why I'm a psychologist, is because I think that there's such an interesting connection going on that's not well understood in terms of our psychology, our mind, and then I'm just going to say the nature of reality,
Mhm.
right? Time and space, and remote viewing is such an interesting phenomenon to me, because it says that we're not bound by Newtonian physics, by time and space like we typically know them.
That was one of the big teachings I got when I became a remote viewer for Russell Targ and Dean Radin over 20 years ago. And I had no idea I could do this. I wasn't trained at it. I was just able to do it when they asked me. But by doing it in an experiment, which I had never done experiments like that before in my life, I was seeing that time was not like I thought it was. And it was taking me to places and making me realize I'm sitting here in an office, but I can tell you something that's going to happen in the future, or something that happened in the past, or something in the present, but I'm just still sitting in that same little office in, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and the information is coming.
Mm-hmm.
So after doing that numerous times, I realized I just had to say, time is not how we, it's like you can bend it or move it, or it's not the way we think of it, as some linear thing like this.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think, I've written a little bit about this, but it's more in like kind of theoretical jargon, just to stay safe, just to like be honest, with the viewers and with you, parapsychology, if you're an academic that's doing work in parapsychology, that can be damaging, or you can be kind of blacklist you, in some ways. So thankfully, West Georgia, they're very open, and I'm very supported by my colleagues. But I've tried to think about these things in terms of the nature of time and space, and in more abstract ways, and sort of sort of written what you just said, which is that at least in terms of our psychology or our mind, we're not bound the same way that our physical body seems to be bound. So there's much more fluidity, right? We can kind of go backwards, forwards, and not just that, but I think the notion of a timeline is so interesting, right? And I think synchronicities get into that. So these coincidences or deja vu, right? They're trying to maybe set us on this right timeline so that we can be who we're meant to be, basically.
Well, your imaginary playmates that you had as a child, they might not have been imaginary. They might have actually been, spirits or family members or people from wanting to just be with you. Because when we're younger, we don't have as many filters here and we're able to see things a little clearer. So as a child, I think you were clearly seeing other beings that you were playing with. And it's much more comfortable for family members or parents to say, oh, those are your imaginary friends, but they might not have been imaginary. We don't know, but they may not have.
Right.
And when you're dreaming precognitively. You're dreaming what's going to happen in the future, even if it's the next day. It's still the future. And there's some kind of, once we start to honor those dreams, they can give us information that can help us. You can avoid a car accident. There's ways that can really help you if you pay attention to the dreams that you were having.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. And then that's sort of the challenge for me is that, and maybe for others too, is that trying to know what to pay attention to and to sift out, because there's so much static and white noise. It's like, what's important, what's not. And so I think I've gotten a little bit better about that, but it's still, it takes practice, I think.
I always find it's, for me, the information, if it's coming, if you want to call it psychically or whatever the word is, uh, for me, it's whatever, it's the fleeting one. It's not something like that just sits there and says it over and over again, like a repeat in your mind. It's something that comes in and comes out really fast. And when I see that, I know that that's the one, not the one that I might be dwelling on or repeating over and over. It's a fleeting moment. And I also find that the more you speak to the intuition of your own self and listen to it, the stronger the voice becomes, and it starts to separate a little from that static and all that noise, because it can be incredibly confusing with all the other things, whether it's a television show you saw or other things that have happened that came into your mind and then you put it together this way or that way. Those can confuse you from the one that's really coming from, I don't know, universal thought or some other place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like that, Gail. And two, I think, this is why, I have that clinical background as a therapist, because that I even, talk with clients about this, how important it is to trust yourself, and so that's what I think you're speaking to, is that, if you're having these visions or having these experiences, you gotta, try and work through them and get to a place where trust yourself and you're kind of feel more certain, more sure of what's happening.
And the more you trust that, I think the stronger you become in that knowingness.
Yeah.
So, did you have any anthropological experiences, or have you traveled and spent time with other cultures?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's a really an important kind of experience to have. Um, I'm not gonna, not, I really haven't, to be fair, I haven't. I mean, of course, I've traveled, but it's been more, so sort of for pleasure, for leisure, to different countries and to take in culture. I just got back from Oslo, Norway, because the PA conference was over there in August.
Mhm.
So the PA just is the Parapsychological Association. Um, so that I don't think that really counts, just because it's Western, it's Europe, it's kind of what I'm used to.
Mhm.
But I academically and experientially, I think it's being around other cultures can be so enriching. So I appreciate that question.
Yes, I think that would be a great thing for you to go and have some of those experiences in the future. So I want to shift now a little bit. So I go towards your new book, Paranormal Ruptures. And I was wondering if we could just start off with the beginning of your subtitle, which says Critical Approaches to Exceptional Experiences. Can you tell us, our listeners, exactly what you mean by that?
Yes. So critical approaches that comes from what's called critical theory in academia, right? In the literature, the scholars write about, and so these critical approaches, critical theory, wants to understand how our subjectivity or our identity is sort of fashioned by social and cultural forces. So let me give you an example, okay? So this isn't paranormal, but let's just say, social media today uh, has a lot to do with the creation of identity and personality in our modern day society. And that's important to pay attention to, right? Because, technology is advancing so quickly that if we're not aware of how we're interfaced with these other technologies and these other things, we're, going to kind of, lose ourselves or not know what's going on. So that's just sort of one example using social media, but there's other examples in terms of society, and I'm thinking institutions, for example, like me being in school for so long and being in a university, right? That shapes and colors my personality,
Mm.
versus if I was, doing a different profession. Um, so that's generally critical theory. And the other part of the subtitle, which is exceptional experiences, sort of grows out of Rhea White's work. So Rhea White was a feminist parapsychologist, and she was interested in taking like a humanistic or a transpersonal approach to the paranormal. And so she came up with the term exceptional human experiences. So EHE. And nowadays, it's sort of more common practice just to shorten it to exceptional experiences. And so I chose that title because I like the term exceptional. I mean, it could be a synonym for paranormal, but it doesn't have the negative connotations, sometimes paranormal. So it's like just exceptional, right? And then experiences is just a really, really rich word, and it speaks to kind of our humanity and to, just our whole holistic sort of being in the world. And so I like that. And so that's in contrast to what some of the experimental researchers would say in parapsychology. They would call the paranormal psi or PPSI, which is, I would argue problematic in some ways because it divorces the paranormal from us.
Mhm.
It's trying to like locate this empty variable in the laboratory, but the paranormal only exists because we experience it. But so I don't know, it's just a little bit of a mismatch, and so that's why I like that full term, exceptional experiences.
It's very well explained. So I understand that because scientists have so much so much up against when they discuss psychic or paranormal and I think Dean explained to me once how many times a scientist in an experiment has to prove, like I'm just saying a number, say 1,000 times to get the scientific community to accept it. But yet, if it was a new drug or some other item that has to be studied, it gets only maybe 50 reviews needed. And all of a sudden the FDA says, okay, that drug is fine. So it seems like the criteria for anyone studying parapsychology, they have to go through so many more hoops to prove their scientific theory than some of the scientists doing things that are really affecting your physical body.
Yes, yeah, that's spot on, and that's why critical approaches or critical theory is so important, because it analyzes that power effect. So in other words, to put it as a question, why do parapsychologists have to prove themselves repeatedly more so than any other science?
Do you have
More so than chemists and
what?
yeah.
Do you know why? Does any
Well, it's it's complex, but to try and put it as simple as possible, there's just a long history in, speaking of anthropology, in the West or in our society, of natural science. Okay. And natural science has a certain way of looking at the world and understanding the world. And that's very different than if we take like a human science approach. Okay, so think of what we just talked about, psi versus exceptional experiences, right? Yeah. So some parapsychologists would disagree with me, but in parapsychology, we're not doing physics, right? We're not physicists, okay? Right, so there's sort of a category error or a mistake going on. So so we're trying to, in other words, we're trying to be this kind of science that we shouldn't want to be, and that's why we're getting so much pushback. So if we can be a more humanistic kind of science, I think that's gonna we're not going to have to prove ourselves constantly, right? We can just sort of listen to these stories, analyze them, and try and understand what's really going on.
I having been a subject in so many different experiments, I've often felt at the end of some of these experiments that I've been in that some of this to me is never going to be explained or proven. It's to me more, I term it in the word of magic because I can't think of another exact proper word. But I feel like some of these things, at least for my functioning, I just accept them as this is the way it is, and it's just some sort of magic. I cannot give an explanation of how I hear voices or how I see things. I don't have an explanation of where it comes from, but that I just accept it, that that's how it is. So I've always thought to scientists that they're working so hard. Why can't they just say, this is the way it is? And this brings me to one of the stories I read in your book that I was hoping you could share. I thought it was a great story. And, correct me if I have the name wrong, but I don't know if it was an anthropologist named Grindal or if it was, I think it was an anthropologist. And it was the Dancing Dead story that he couldn't speak about for 20 years. When I think of the impact of him seeing such an amazing thing and then holding it inside that long, I thought this is an example of what we're talking about. And I thought the story was a great, I mean, I would have loved to have seen such a thing. And I'm not saying I don't believe it or I do believe it. I'm saying I'm hearing his experience and I accept that he did experience this. Could you tell that story to our listeners?
Well, so let me just say that with that chapter, I think it's chapter 3. So Jack Hunter actually wrote or contributed that chapter, and he, I have it pulled up in front of me, but I'm not, I'm not wouldn't do a great job trying to summarize it, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating because Jack takes an anthropological approach, and he identifies 3 stories, and this is one of the 3 stories that we would think would be impossible.
Right.
Just
Great story.
it's so fascinating. I mean, then the other part is that these are from respectable anthropologists, right? These aren't, somebody walking down the street and saying they saw something.
Right.
These are professional anthropologists that are respected, and they're saying that this is what they saw, this is what they experienced. And it's like, what do we, as professionals, right, what do we do with that, right? We can't just discredit it. We have to take them seriously. And so Jack uses these 3 stories. There's the flying coffin story. the one that we just talked about, and there's another one too. But he uses them to try and understand how reality isn't just like our discussion of time and space. It's not as stable as we think it is. So there's this, he uses the word, I think, permeability. So the things are sort of permeable and can intermix. And that's a better way to think of reality than thinking, everything's structured, linear time, linear space, you know. Well, it's most of the time, but not all the time. And these three stories are examples of when things kind of get weird.
Can you tell the audience the story of is it kind of there at the tip of your tongue? I don't
Oh my
remember what country
gosh.
he went to or what culture he was in. I don't know if it was the Philippines. I think it was the Philippines.
Yeah, so it was an incident including 4 days leading up to an event at a funeral.
Hmm.
Okay, and it was a ceremony and a death divination that was a part of this. In it was in Ghana actually. So
Ghana.
the Sisala people of Ghana
Hmm.
in October 1967. And it was the anthropologist that first told the story was Bruce T. Grindle. Um, and I just don't want to butcher it, but I think in general, Grindle, talks about how he witnessed this ceremonial leader. It was interesting because he was sort of like enmeshed with the tribe and kind of became a part of this ceremony. Um, so yeah, I don't know. He had so the anthropologist Grindle had his hand back to the healer, and he would beat down on an iron hoe. The spit would fly from his mouth, and suddenly the flashes of light flew like sparks from a fire. So then the anthropologist felt their body get rigid, their jaw tightened, and at the base of their skull, they felt a jolt as though their head had been snapped off their spinal column. Terrible and beautiful sight burst upon Grindle, stretching from the amazingly delicate fingers and mouths of the Goka, which is just the healer. Strands of fibrous light played upon the head, fingers, and toes of the dead man. So the corpse, right, in the ceremony, was shaken by spasms, then rose to its feet, spinning and dancing in a frenzy. So it's, I could go on, right? There's more, but I mean, it's just so astounding, right? That this is what happened. And, you know, how is that story critical in nature? Because it defies and it pushes back against our normal understanding of reality. You
I,
know, how would science describe that?
right. And death, you don't hear about that happening in death here.
Right.
But in Ghana, that might be a common, that might be a common event at a funeral. It might not be the first time a deceased body started to shake and come to life. I mean, not to life, but to movement.
Right.
And I've never heard that story, and I was just blown away by it. And I don't deny that it happened. I'm just blown away that this man had to wait 20 years. How he must have been so affected by seeing such an experience like that he couldn't even write about it.
Right. Right. Right.
But
And
people would tell him he was crazy, or I don't know what they would have said to him.
yeah, and that's what we're trying to change with the book, right? That I'm trying to change is that people shouldn't be fearful of telling their stories, and even more importantly, these stories are really important for researchers, right? They help us understand the human condition, what's going on, and we got to, I strongly advocate for pushing back against the stigma of paranormal experiences because it's done nothing but harm to people. So yeah, so I think that hearing the story again just sort of is amazing, and just speaks to just the power of culture,
Mhm.
yeah, and belief, that go into, being a human.
Yes. And when you travel around the world and you see other healing, in the times I spent in the Huichol community, nobody goes and runs to a medical doctor down in the city. They're up in the mountains, and the shaman that's their shaman, because there are many different shamans to pick from. And the shaman is the person they're going to, whether it's a mental issue or a physical issue. And the healing may be done with, bird feathers and other items, and a healing can occur. But that would not fit into a scientific answer as to how did this person get rid of their cancer, or how did this actually occur. I've had a lot of these unusual experiences that you talk about, and all I can tell people is they're my experience. And if I didn't, I mean, I didn't believe in spoon bending, but then when I started bending spoons, I realized, oh, you can bend spoons. So I'm not like a skeptic, but I'm also, you know, I also have an open mind, and I don't like to say yes or no. I like to see for myself and then decide. But I don't say, oh no, that never happened. Oh yes, that could happen. I like to experience it. Then I feel like this is my experience. This is how I experienced that when I went to this culture or that culture. These are the things I saw that was not the things that I see, say, in the United States. And I think there's so much rich information out there in all those other places to teach the Western world. Uh, I just, anyway, so I think this is a wonderful thing, that what you're trying to do is take away from the scientists the idea that this all has to be proven in some scientific way, and that the more important thing is gathering the information and the stories that the people actually experience. Because you do find, like when you speak about moody and near-death experiences, things like this that touch people directly, immediately in the current time, they can't deny that. They can't deny when they've died and they've seen experiences of connections to souls they know that have already deceased, that you can't say to them now that that didn't happen. You can't tell them that they think that maybe dying isn't the same way as we think of it, as just the body goes and that's it. They've experienced something else, and they've often sometimes returned with more heightened sensations to be able to understand or see things in other realms. Uh, I had one of my guests on Ribadao. She clinically died in a drowning, and when she came back, her life and everything she did was completely changed. And she became like, she didn't know she could bend spoons, like hundreds and hundreds of spoons. Her psychic side just opened up hugely. So those things, I think, that can't be denied, because they may occur in a hospital. They may occur with doctors around, ones that tell them stories about, I know this and this and this you did to me, but they saw the person was completely clinically, out on drugs, and yet they're able to conceive what was going on during their surgeries. It seems to me there's so much out there that I can't believe that they can't finally just say yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, I love what you're talking about in terms of the transformational aspect to these experiences.
Mhm.
Science doesn't know what to do with that.
And it's so important.
That's, I mean, yeah, that's like an essential part of the experience, right? And so, science just doesn't, they don't have the methods, the experiments, they can't understand that significance, how transformative it can be. And they're not interested in that. They're looking at, I don't know, I'm thinking of, neurology, they're looking at what's going on in the brain. If you have an NDE, maybe the brain is releasing these chemicals, and, so on and so forth, which is fine. But, I'm saying what I think we're both saying is that there's something more important going on. It's not just brain chemistry. It's this kind of transformational experience that this person is having. and we can't talk about it, explain it in terms of just neurons, in terms of the brain.
I participated in one of those brain experiments, and it was paid for by the NHK in Japan. And it was up at the University of Washington, and it was conducted by Leanna Standish, who was a neuroscientist. And we were the second couple ever to do this experiment, but it was considered a telepathic experiment. But they now had an fMRI machine, so they can functionally see your brain working at the same time. And they were able to see that there was a change of blood flow in the brain during the telepathy part of the experiment. So this is, I was just there doing the telepathy and being in the fMRI machine. But the things that they were looking for were things like that. They found a change of blood flow. So they showed there was some effect going on in the brain during the telepathic communication.
Right.
And, like to me, that was really beyond my, I can do the telepathy, but I can't understand all the scientific research and the brain and all the things that they were looking for, or how it lights up, or what exactly they see. But I thought that was pretty amazing that neuroscientists themselves were really looking into this kind of phenomena. So I have some more questions here for you about what do you mean when you say that science and paranormal science are human creations and culturally bound? Is that about did we just sort of cover that? Or is there a way of answering that question?
Yeah, I think we've covered that a little bit, but again, I would just say that science wasn't handed down to us from God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right? Science is something we created. It's been arguably one of the best methods at getting to truth about the world, right? But it's flawed, and it has flaws. To speak about critical theory a bit, I think I talk about feminism in the book, and there was a conference in 1991. I think it was called Parapsychology and Feminism. That was in 91. And then in honor of that conference, just last year, the Journal of Anomalistics sort of published a special issue on feminism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is in parapsychology, right? The paranormal in relation to what feminism is. And so feminism is a critical approach because it understands it tries to see how women have historically been excluded or marginalized, and it tries to bring social justice to those issues. Okay, and so I'm saying that because, to circle back to your question about science and paranormal science being human creations and culturally bound, science is guilty of, and still this happens today, is guilty of being prejudiced and discriminating against certain groups of people,
Mm-hmm.
women, African Americans, LGBTQ individuals, so on and so forth, and more, maybe even more importantly, those models that are outside of the West.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's what the fancy word is Eurocentric, just means centered around Europe. So like it has these Eurocentric models, science does, and it excludes all the rest. Oh, you're not scientific, you're not doing the real stuff. So anyway, so I'm saying that just because I think the critical approach helps us understand that, right? And we have to be careful, because what we think is true, what we're doing right today, we could realize in 20 years that we're actually doing people a disservice.
I'm thinking your particular job, being a psychologist and therapist for others, that often those people get misdiagnosed by other people in the field, where if they say, yes, I hear voices, they immediately label them as a schizophrenic, or they need to be on drugs, or there aren't enough, is not enough information. The therapist is only trained in schooling, but they haven't been around enough experiences to know that maybe these people are having out of body experiences or other things that are happening to them, that they're not crazy. It's just that the psychiatrist or psychologist isn't familiar with these things that could happen. I'm not saying that there isn't also a craziness where people do hear voices. Yes, of course there is that. But I think a lot of people get misdiagnosed in situations like this sometimes because the person that they're seeing, the doctor they're seeing, may not understand that they are having unusual, exceptional experiences.
Right, right, exactly. And that's why, we've got to raise awareness around these things. I'm thinking of, the Hearing Voices Network. It's not a paranormal network, but it's work to try and normalize just hearing different voices, hearing things, thinking outside of what's considered normal. Right? So, I think that's good, right? The tendency to just jump to diagnosing someone can be really harmful, if the clinicians aren't careful about that.
So how do you think future science will incorporate what we now call anomalous or paranormal experiences?
Oh, let me put my precognitive glasses on.
Okay.
Okay?
Time.
All right. I don't know. I mean, okay. So I think that, and there's actually a chapter, the last chapter in the book talks a little bit about this. So there's, Elon Musk has a company called Neuralink right now, where they're trying to interface like a computer and a machine with our brain, and this is going to allow for a form of telepathy. Okay, so I mean, this, listeners can Google this, right? This is, kind of out there. It's not really talked a lot about, but it's going to allow for you to interface with the world, use your mind, and communicate maybe with other people or with objects. Okay?
Actually, my husband just started working with this amazing woman, Charlotte, and she has created a robot to, well, she's had scientists create a robot to create an orchestra where the robot is playing. The first piece we've seen is the robot plays a cello, and you're seeing the robot play the cello, but her ultimate plan is to get a few other instruments in this group all being played by robots, but she wants to figure out a way to hook her brain up to an EKG machine where her brain would actually conduct the music that the robots would be playing. And that sounds something like what you just said, which I thought, wow, seemed like an amazing thing. So she's been talking to my husband about working on software, or how can we do this? How can we make the brain control the robots to play the music, and she would be the conductor, but it would all be her brain conducting these robots.
Right.
So that sounds like what you're saying Elon Musk is doing with this. With it's just, for me, it's too far out there for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think, everybody's sort of aware of AI now, artificial intelligence, right? That was huge over the last year.
My husband got his PhD in that at MIT,
Yeah.
but that was 30 years ago. I mean, a long time ago in the 80s.
Right. So he was ahead of the curve.
Yes. I would say to him, what are you going to do with a degree in AI? What can you do with this? And now it's all we see in the news.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
And there's positive things about it and negative things, just like any of these new technologies.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, for sure. And you know, in the last chapter, you know, that talks a little bit about some of these positives and negatives about, you know, so on the one hand, if we stick with technology, you know, these so-called paranormal things are going to become more normal.
mhm.
You know, I mean, just using your mind to interact with, you know, another person. You know, if you and I both had that Neuralink implant, you know, theoretically we could just send telepathic messages to each other.
Well, I do that all the time without the implant.
Okay.
And I'm very grateful to have that, because when my friends, I've been involved with the Huichol Indians since the 80s, and I've never stopped being involved. And I've been down there for 6 trips to the remote area in the mountains of Mexico. And for all those beginning 25 years, I only communicated telepathically, and that's how I would get someone from down there to call me. They would get my telepathic message, they'd get to a switchboard, we'd have a conversation, we'd make a plan. Now they all have cell phones. Nobody had cell phones there then, and I'm kind of wondering what's going to happen to these cultures where they've automatically been telepathically communicating. When I was there, I'd say, "How did he just appear in the woods here when we have to go meet him?" Oh, they just know the message gets there, you know. So now it's going to be cell phones, and so strange to me to speak to my friend Julio and call him on a cell phone when we used to do it telepathically. When I was initiated as a Buryat into Buryat Mongolian shamanism, we had 6 days of preparation and no translator. And I don't speak a word of Mongolian. Well, I speak 2 words. And my teacher Zagda, she didn't speak a word of English. And when we were interviewed for a film, they asked her, "How did you communicate to Gail when you don't speak her language?" And she said, "I would just think what I want, and then Gail would be inside my brain, and I would tell her, and then she would do it." And I've often thought that this was something scientists have not studied.
Right.
And maybe this is something for you to check out. But why is it that I'm able to telepathically communicate with, and this is not the first culture that I've done this with other cultures that do not speak the language that we both speak, and yet we communicate perfectly about what we need to do? Down to, she was asking in her mind, she wanted me to have this special herb from Siberia, and I came rushing down the stairs with exactly that herb someone had given me years before. How did I know that? I'm just saying, how can you communicate? And we've had translators where we were going to get a translation, and they say, "I don't have to translate for you because you both just said the same thing." So has anybody looked into that? I don't know anyone that's looked into the idea that the communication telepathically doesn't necessarily have to be in your language. So
I
what's going on? And I have proof of it. It's not like I didn't experience it dozens and dozens of times.
This is such an interesting observation to me, and I think more research, of course. I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't know any sort of systematic research that's been done on this. But Gail, I've heard this from others. I've heard it not just from you, but from other people who have, you know, psychic experiences. They say this, that and I you know, maybe I brush up against this a little bit in the book because critical theories really focused on language.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is something, right, about language. We don't, it seems like, to send or receive messages, there's not a translation or translator involved, right?
None.
There's, I don't know what to call it, like a connection, you know, an impression, but there's something sort of beyond or outside of language that is going on. And it's, you know, it just hasn't been examined enough. But I've heard this story many times before.
And it's not even like when I talk about the Huichols or the Mongolians, it might be in regards to shaman things or rituals and things like this. But I've experienced it in Japan when I stayed with Japanese family. and they were having some kind of a difficulty with the daughter, I knew everything that happened without being told a word in English or see anything. It's not like I saw an altercation or any of this. I was just like, oh, this is what just happened. And like they were just like, how did you know that? And I just, and they're not thinking in English, they're only thinking in Japanese. So
Right.
I don't know. So it doesn't have to necessarily be about a spiritual thing. It can just be about, some problematic thing in the family. And I'm sitting there knowing, oh, she did this with the ATM machine and this happened and that happened and she didn't tell you. And
Yeah, that's that I would call it alternative ways of knowing.
oh,
So it's
good. I like that.
yeah, alternative ways of knowing. So it's not just, think of science, it accumulates knowledge, research, that's kind of more rationality, like in your head, up here, right? But these other ways of knowing, alternative ways of knowing, it's, I think it's, the term maybe intuition or hunch or, gut, your kind of guts telling you this, right? That's not in your head, that's not rationality, that
Right.
comes from somewhere else, and it kind of like it's like almost a download. It hits you all at once and you just know.
Exactly. That's that. I like that what you're saying. I like your other description because I only just say when people ask me when I say, "Oh, so and so is going to die," and they say, "How do you know?" And I say, "I don't know how I know. I just know, and I can't give you an answer. My only answer, and I don't mean to sound, egoistic or anything like that about it, but I have no other answer other than I just know.
Right,
That's
right,
all I can say."
right. And I think, Gail, I think because you've had so much experience, doing these things, right? You've learned to trust yourself.
Hmm.
I think that sort of speaks to, your people really respecting you and taking you so seriously. Like when you know something, because have experienced so many things, you just know it because you're at a point now, like where you just trust yourself more.
It's a good, and it takes years to get to that place. And actually, when any of the things happen of exceptional experience, I never take it for granted.
Hmm.
Whenever it happens, I always honor and welcome it and say thank you very much. And I'm always feel like a little. It's almost like inside my body, a little thing goes, whoo, like it's like a surprise each time. So it doesn't matter how many years that might have happened. I never feel like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. I always feel like it's a special gift or surprise that came in, and I'm always grateful for it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's important too.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So we're coming down on our hour now, and so this is where I would like you to share anything about your book that you would like our listeners to know to wrap it up, and to, like suggestions of who you think this book is good for or what they might learn when they read this.
Yeah, yeah. So Paranormal Ruptures, Critical Approaches to Exceptional Experiences is my new book. It's available on Amazon. So you can order it off Amazon. There's an ebook version for Kindle, or you can order a paperback. And probably the viewers probably got a sense for this so far, but it's sort of more academic, okay? But I think that, people that, are just sort of have a general interest in the paranormal, if you stick with it, you can glean some really important insights out of some of the chapters. So,
Hmm.
just kind of like a red flag, yeah, it's written to be read by, university students or university professors, but I think some of the chapters are more accessible than others. So, yeah, and the other part that I like about the book is that, it's you can kind of pick and choose which chapter to start at. It's not, a book that starts from cover to finish, right? These are collected chapters. So,
Yes.
if you're interested in Bigfoot, then read chapter 2. If you're interested in AI, then read the last chapter. So there's that kind of cool feature about it, is that you can kind of jump around.
And the peoples that you're presenting information from their work are all very reputable. I don't know if you just want to speak a little bit about the few different people who you have in there that are telling these incredible stories. They're not just somebody who happened to walk by your house and tell you. They're
Right.
very, very reputable people. So if you could just speak a little bit about them so our listeners would know the information and where you were getting some of this from.
Yeah, yep. So the contributors, I myself have a chapter in there, but I also have, university faculty, so professors and psychologists and anthropologists, right, that have, an appointment at a university, right? So these are, very reputable people. And then there's also a couple students as well. That I like. There's a PhD student that has a chapter in there, and a master's student that has a chapter in there. So, it's kind of a broad swath, but these are people that are immersed in the research, and you know, uh, their reputations are on the line. So they're not just gonna give you, make something up, right? They want to put forth like a very careful argument, and really kind of lay it out for you.
And so, who were some of those people?
Yeah, so David Mitchell, Dr. David Mitchell, he's at CEIS, which is the California Institute for Integral Studies.
Know it
Right.
well.
Yeah. Dr. Jack Hunter. Okay, I think he's at Sophia University. I might have that wrong. But he has a university position, and he's based in the United Kingdom,
Mhm.
okay, in Wales. Dr. Christine Simmons Moore. So she's my colleague at West Georgia. So she's there, and
Involved
yeah.
in the research center also.
So what'd you say, Gail? Sorry.
And I think Christine Simmons, isn't she also involved at the Rhine Research Center?
She is. She's involved at the Ryan Research Center. Her and John Kruth I know they're working on a study right now. So they're collaborating with each other. And we're always at West Georgia, we're always talking to the Rhine.
Mhm. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's very reputable. And the fact that you're co-editor of the Parapsychological Association Minefield also is, if anyone doesn't know, it's a very reputable magazine that's pulled out 3 times a year by the Parapsychological Association. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it's like a bulletin, like a newsletter, but people can send in essays, based on the theme, and most of the time these are scholars in the field, right? Sort of kind of giving their own take on that theme for the issue. So yeah, it's published by the PA, which is the Parapsychological Association, and you can just Google Minefield PA, and it'll come right up.
Yes. It has great, just any involvement in the Rhine research for anyone who's never heard about it. They can find incredible classes and courses also being taught by some of the people you spoke about and others. And it's a reputable organization that's been around for a very long time.
Yes, I would agree. Yep.
Yes. So, is there any words of wisdom you'd like to share with anyone here?
I'm thinking about what we began talking about, which is sort of, I guess the theme for our discussion today is I keep going back to this word trust. Just learning to kind of trust yourself, trust your intuition. And again, I never really, had this vision of how my future was going to play out. I knew that I liked school. I knew that I was interested in the paranormal.
Mhm.
But that's all I knew. So I'm like trying to just experiment and go with it along the way. And then, I was so fortunate that this is how it ended up. So I think, just learning to trust yourself, knowing who you are, and trying to bring that forward and give back to the world. That's what's led me, being a therapist, a teacher, is that I feel like I can give back to others, and that's so rewarding.
Well, that's a very wonderful thing to share. I'm not a teacher, but I'm hoping that by doing these podcasts, whether they reach 100 people or thousands of people, if just anyone that's listening to them, it benefits them in some way, I feel like then I've done my job. So I'm trying to help in that way and reach people differently than, say, when I give a talk somewhere, there's only that 100 people there. But when you do a podcast, it can go anywhere around in the world to any person that may listen. And if they get information that helps them along the way, or they find out that there's a place like the Rhine Research, these are the things, a way of connecting people to other experiences. So I'm hoping in my little way here on this little small, medium, at large podcast that we do that. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. And people will be able to find your book on Amazon. I'll have information on the description of your website or places where people can contact you. And I want to thank you so much for being with us here today. And if you'll just hold tight while we did a little closing. Okay, listeners, I hope you enjoyed our show today. We enjoyed having our guest, Jacob. And we want to just remind you to subscribe, like, share, comment. And I want to thank my daughter, Nancy, for posting all the shows. And I want to thank my son, Richard, for producing these shows. So have a very wonderful day. Remember to share your stories, because stories can heal. Bye.